Good afternoon, and welcome back to These Small Hours podcast. I am Russell Cordell Staker. Doing something a little bit differently here today. I'm actually broadcasting from Park City, Utah, where I am spending the month of December with my family for Christmas in this time of pandemic in a beautiful little home up here. Something that we figured we could get away with given the fact that the kids have been online at school and my wife's been working from home. And I've been doing the same thing here as well. So I'm going to be producing this show from Park City. What I'm going to do today actually is going to read Dylan Thomas's A Child's Christmas in Wales. I don't believe I'm going to be breaking any laws. I think given the fact that this is public domain, or at least it is in the country of Canada, I did some research, and I don't make any money doing this podcast. I don't think I'm going to get in too much trouble. And if I do, then I would just kindly say to anybody that knows Dylan Thomas or in his memory that my youngest son is actually Dylan Thomas Staker as well. So this is a fitting story. It's something I wanted to just read for the sake of Christmas, and I'm just going to put out there as it's had a huge influence on me over the years, and it was also gifted to me just prior to the birth of our son, who derives his name from Dylan Thomas as well. Just by way of context, to give a little history about Dylan Thomas. This was a piece of prose that he wrote. He was a Welsh poet. It was recorded as a reading in about 1952, and it stemmed from a piece that he wrote for the BBC Radio, of which he did numerous broadcasts. And I've been a big fan of Dylan Thomas as far back as I can remember. It was a work as an anecdotal reminiscence, as he described it, of a Christmas from a viewpoint from a young boy portraying a nostalgic and simpler time. It was later pressed and printed in 1955. Dylan Marlays Thomas was born in Swansea, Wales, United Kingdom on 27 October 1914, and he died at the very young age of 39 on 9 November 1953 in Greenwich Village, New York. He rests in Larne, Carmarthenshire, Wales, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. I have never actually been to Wales, but on my father's side, derived primarily from his own mother, who was a Jenkins, I have Welsh blood intermixed along with German, Dutch, and Danish on my mother's side as well, so I'm kind of a mongrel dog myself. Dylan Thomas was a poet and a writer, and most famous for the poem "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night," and "Death Shall Have No Domain." He did a play for voices, which is very famous under Milkwood, and which was also produced, I believe, by the BBC, and has had international renown in the years since his passing. I'm just checking my notes here, too. Forgive the sound of pages turning. I'm actually recording this in the back of my wife's car in the garage in the house that we're renting because our little son, Dylan Thomas, is taking a nap right now. And I think it's like 25 degrees, and we're due for a foot of snow tomorrow, which is delightful. Coming from Texas, it's a nice change. And actually, I'm a native of Utah, so it's nice to be back up in my old stomping grounds. One final thing I would say about Dylan Thomas, he was known for his stories and wildly popular on his radio broadcasts. And what drew me to him at a young age was the sound of his voice. Now, I am not Welsh, and I'm not going to try to mimic that, although I will read this in the best voice that I can give it, out of due respect to Dylan Thomas. So without further ado, and a Merry Christmas to everyone who's listening, this is a bonus edition of These Small Hours podcast, or These Small Hours podcast. This is Dylan Thomas's A Child's Christmas in Wales. And as I read this too, unfortunately, I'm not in the studio, so you're going to hear me hopefully not fumble too much with the microphone as I turn the pages to read this as well. Let me get situated here. Low production value, but again, it is what it is, and it's an honor to be able to read this. A Child's Christmas in Wales by Dylan Thomas. One Christmas was so much like another in those years around the Seatown corner, now and out of all sound except the distant speaking of the voices I sometimes hear a moment before sleep, that I can never remember whether it snowed for 6 days and 6 nights when I was 12, or whether it snowed for 12 days and 12 nights when I was 6. All the Christmases rolled down toward the two-tongued sea like a cold and headlong moon bundling down the sky that was our street. And they stop at the rim of the ice-edged, fish-freezing waves, and I plunge my hands in the snow and bring out whatever I can find. In goes my hand into that wool-white, bell-tongued ball of holidays resting at the rim of the carol-singing sea, and out come Miss Prothero and the fireman. It was on the afternoon of the day of Christmas Eve, and I was in Miss Prothero's garden, waiting for Cats with her son Jim. It was snowing. It was always snowing at Christmas. December in my memory is white as Lapland, though there were no reindeers, but there were cats. Patient, cold, and callous, our hands wrapped in socks, we waited to snowball the cats. Sleek and long as jaguars and horrible-whiskered, spitting and snarling, they would slink and sidle over the white back garden walls and the lynx-eyed hunters, Jim and I fur-capped and moccasined trappers. From Hudson Bay, off Mumbles Road, would hurl our deadly snowballs at the green of their eyes. The wise cats never appeared. We were so still, Eskimo-footed, Arctic marksmen in the muffling silence of the eternal snows, eternal ever since Wednesday, that we never heard Mrs. Prothero's first cry from her igloo at the bottom of the garden. Or if we heard it at all, it was to us like the far-off challenge of our enemy and prey, the neighbor's polar cat. But soon the voice grew louder. "Fire!" cried Miss Prothero, and she beat the dinner gong. And we ran down the garden with the snowballs in our arms toward the house, and smoke, indeed, was pouring out the dining room, and the gong was bombulating, and Mrs. Prothero was announcing ruin like a town crier in Pompeii. This was better than all the cats in Wales standing on the wall in a row. We bounded into the house laden with snowballs and stopped at the open door of the smoke-filled room. Something was burning all right. Perhaps it was Mr. Prothero, who always slept there after midday dinner with a newspaper over his face. But he was standing in the middle of the room saying, "A fine Christmas," and smacking at the smoke with a slipper. "Call the fire brigade," cried Mrs. Prothero as she beat the gong. "They won't be there," said Mr. Prothero. "It's Christmas." There was no fire to be seen, only clouds of smoke, and Mr. Prothero standing in the middle of them, waving his slipper as though he were conducting. "Do something," he said. And we threw all our snowballs into the smoke. I think we missed Mr. Prothero and ran out of the house to the telephone box. "Let's call the police as well," Jim said, "and the ambulance. And Ernie Jenkins, he likes fires." But we only called the fire brigade, and soon the fire engine came, and 3 tall men in helmets brought a hose into the house, and Mr. Prothero got out just in time before they turned it on. Nobody could ever have a noisier Christmas Eve. And when the firemen turned off the hose and was standing in the wet, smoky room, Jim's aunt, Miss Prothero, came downstairs and peered in at them. Jim and I waited very quietly to hear what she would say to them. She said the right thing always. She looked at the 3 tall firemen in their shining helmets, standing among the smoke and cinders and dissolving snowballs, and she said, "Would you like something to read?" Years and years ago, when I was a boy, when there were wolves in Wales and birds the color of red flannel petticoats whiskered past the harp-shaped hills, when we sang and wallowed all night and day in caves that smelt like Sunday afternoons and damp front farmhouse parlors, and we chased with the jawbones of deacons, the English, and the bears, before the motor car, before the wheel, before the duchess-faced horse. When we rode that daft and happy hills bareback, it snowed and it snowed. But here a small boy says, "It snowed last year too. I made a snowman, and my brother knocked it down, and I knocked my brother down, and then we had tea." But that was not the same snow, I say. Our snow was not only shaken from the whitewashed buckets down the sky, it came shawling out of the ground and swam and drifted out of the arms and hands and bodies of the trees. Snow grew overnight on the roofs of the houses like a pure grandfather moss, minutely white-ivied the walls and settled on the postman, opening the gate like a dumb, numb thunderstorm of white, torn Christmas cards. Were there postmen then, too? With sprinkling eyes and wind-cherried noses on spread frozen feet, they crunched up the doors and mittened on them manfully. But all that the children could hear was a ringing of bells. You mean that the postman went rat-a-tat-tat and the doors rang? I mean that the bells that the children could hear were inside them. I only hear thunder sometimes, never bells. There were church bells, too. Inside them? No, no, no. In the bat-black, snow-white belfries tugged by bishops and storks, and they rang their tidings over the bandaged town, over the frozen foam of the powder and ice cream hills, over the crackling sea. It seemed that all the churches boomed for joy under my window, and the weathercocks crew for Christmas on our fence. Get back to the postmen. They were just ordinary postmen, fond of walking in dogs and Christmas in the snow. They knocked on the doors with blue knuckles. Ours has got a black knocker. And then they stood on the white welcome mat in the little drifted porches and huffed and puffed, making ghosts with their breath, and jogged from foot to foot like small boys wanting to go out. And then the presents? And then the presents, after the Christmas box, and the cold postman with a rose on his button nose tingled down the tea-trade slithered run of the chilly glinting hill. He went in his ice-bound boots like a man in fishmonger's slabs. He wagged his bag like a frozen camel's hump, dizzily turned the corner on one foot, and by God, he was gone. Get back to the presents. There were the useful presents, engulfing mufflers of the old coach days, and mittens made for giant sloths, and zebra scarfs of a substance like silky gum that could be tug-o-warred down to the galoshes, blinding tam-o'-shanters like patchwork tea cozies, and bunny-suited busbies and balaclavas for victims of head-shrinking tribes. From aunts who always wore wool next to the skin, there were mustached and rasping vests that made you wonder why the aunts had any skin left at all. And once I had a little crocheted nose bag from an aunt now, alas, no longer whinnying with us, and pictureless books in which small boys, though warned with quotations not to wood skate on Farmer Giles' pond, and did and drowned, and books that told me everything about the wasp, except why. Go on to the useless presents. Bags of moist and many-colored jelly babies in folded flag and a false nose, and a tram conductor's cap, and a machine that punched tickets and rang a bell. Never a catapult, once by mistake that no one could explain, a little hatchet, and a celluloid duck that made, when you pressed it, a most unduck-like sound, a mewing moo, that an ambitious cat might make who wished to be a cow, and a painting book in which I could make the grass, the trees, the sea, and the animals any color I pleased. And still the dazzling sky, blue sheep are gazing in the red field under the rainbow-billed and pea-green birds, hard-boileds, toffee, fudge, and all sorts, crunches, cracknel, humbugs, glaciers, marzipan, and butter Welsh for the Welsh, and troops of bright tin soldiers who, if they could not fight, could always run, and snakes and families and happy ladders and easy hobby games for little engineers, complete with instructions. Oh, easy for Leonardo. And a whistle to make the dogs bark, to wake up the old man next door, to make him beat on the wall with his stick, and shake our picture off the wall, and packet of cigarettes. You put one in your mouth, and you stood at the corner of the street, and you waited for hours in vain for an old lady to scold you for smoking a cigarette, and then, with a smirk, you ate it, and then it was breakfast under the balloons. Were there uncles, like in our house? There are always uncles at Christmas. The same uncles, and on Christmas mornings, with dog-disturbing whistle and sugar fags, I would scour the swathed town for the news of the little world, and find always a dead bird by the white post office, or by the deserted swings, perhaps a robin, all but one of his fires out, men and women wading or scooping back from chapel with taproom noses and wind-bust cheeks, all albinos, huddled their stiff black jarring feathers against the irreligious snow. Mistletoe hung from the gas brackets in all the front parlors. There was sherry and walnuts and bottled beer and crackers by the dessert spoons, and cats in their furabouts watched the fires, and high-heaped fire spat all ready for the chestnuts and the mulling pokers. Some few large men sat in the front parlors without their collars, uncles almost certainly trying their new cigars, holding them out judiciously at arm's length, returning them to their mouths, coughing, then holding them out again as though waiting for the explosion. And some few small aunts, not wanted in the kitchen or anywhere else for that matter, sat on the very edges of their chairs, poised and brittle, afraid to break, like faded cups and saucers. Not many those mornings trod the piling streets. An old man always, fawn-bowlered, yellow-gloved, and at this time of year with spats of snow would take his constitutional to the white bowling green and back, as he would take it wet or fine on Christmas Day or Doomsday. Sometimes 2 hale young men with big pipes blazing, no overcoats and wind-blown scarves would trudge unspeaking down to the forlorn sea, to work up an appetite, to blow away the fumes, who knows, to walk into the waves until nothing of them was left but the 2 curling smoke clouds of their indistinguishable briars. Then I would be slapdashing home, the gravy smell of the dinners of others, the bird smell, the brandy, the pudding, and mince, coiling up to my nostrils when out of a snow-clogged side lane would come a boy, the spit of myself with a pink-tipped cigarette and the violet past of a black eye, cocky as a bullfinch, leering all to himself. I hated him on sight and sound and would be about to put my dog whistle to my lips and blow him off the face of Christmas, when suddenly he, with a violet wink, put his whistle to his lips and blew so stridently, so high, so exquisitely loud, that gobbling faces, their cheeks bulged with goose, would press against their tinselled windows the whole length of the white echoing street. For dinner we had turkey and a blazing pudding, and after dinner the uncles sat in front of the fire, loosened all buttons, put their large moist hands over their watch chains, groaned a little, and slept. Mothers, aunts, and sisters scuttled to and fro bearing tureens. Aunt Bessie, who had already been frightened twice by a clockwork mouse, whimpered at the sideboard and had some elderberry wine. The dog was sick. Auntie Dosey had to have 3 aspirins, but Auntie Hannah, who liked port, stood in the middle of the snowbound backyard singing like a big-bosomed thrush. I would blow up balloons to see how big they would blow up to, and then, when they burst, which they all did, the uncles jumped and rumbled. In the rich and heavy afternoon, the uncles breathing like dolphins and the snow descending, I would sit among festoons and Chinese lanterns and nibble dates and try to make a model man-o'-war, following the instructions for little engineers, and produce what might be mistaken for a sea-going tramcar. Or I would go out, my bright new boots squeaking, into the white world, on to the seaward hill, to call on Jim and Dan and Jack, and to pad through the still streets, leaving huge deep footprints on the hidden pavements. I bet people will think there's been hippos. What would you do if you saw a hippo coming down our street? I'd go like this, bang! I'd throw him over the railings and roll him down the hill, and then I'd tickle him under the ear, and he'd wag his tail. What would you do if you saw 2 hippos? Iron-flanked and bellowing he-hippos clanked and battered through the scudding snow toward us as we passed Mr. Daniel's house. Let's post Mr. Daniel a snowball through his letterbox. Let's write some things in the snow. Let's write, Mr. Daniels looks like a spaniel, all over his lawn. Or he walked on the white shore. Can the fishes see it's snowing? The silent, one-clouded heavens drifted on to the sea, and now we were snow-blind travelers lost on the north hills, and vast dew-lapped dogs with flasks round their necks ambled and shambled up to us, baying Excelsior. We returned home through the poor streets where only a few children fumbled with bare red fingers in the wheel-rutted snow, and cat called after us, their voices fading away as we trudged uphill into the cries of the dock birds and the hooting of ships out in the whirling bay. And then at tea, the recovered uncles would be jolly, and the ice cake loomed in the center of the table like a marble grave. Auntie Hannah laced her tea with rum, because it was only once a year. "Bring out the tall tales now," and we told by the fire as the gaslight bubbled like a diver. Ghosts wooed like owls in the long nights when I dared not look over my shoulder. Animals lurked in the cubbyhole under the stairs where the gas meter ticked, and I remember that we were singing carols once when there wasn't the shaving of a moon to light the flying streets. At the end of a long road was a drive that led to a large house, and we stumbled up the darkness of the drive that night, each one of us afraid, each one holding a stone in his hand in case, and all of us too brave to say a word. The wind through the trees made noises as of old and unpleasant and maybe web-footed men wheezing in caves. We reached the black bulk of the house. "What shall we give them?" hawked the herald. "No," Jack said. "Good King Wenceslas. I'll count 3. That's Wenceslas. 1, 2, 3, and we began to sing our voices high and seemingly distant in the snow-felted darkness, round the house that was occupied by nobody we knew. We stood close together near the dark door. Good King Wenceslas looked out on the feast of Stephen. And then a small dry voice, like the voice of someone who has not spoken for a long time, joined our singing. A small dry eggshell voice from the other side of the door, a small dry voice through the keyhole. And when we stopped running, we were outside our house. The front room was lovely, balloons floating under the hot water, bottle gulping gas. Everything was good again and shone over the town. "Perhaps it was a ghost," Jim said. "Perhaps it was trolls," Dan said, who was always reading. "Let's go in and see if there's any jelly left," Jack said, and we did that. Always on Christmas night there was music. An uncle played the fiddle, a cousin sang Cherry Ripe, and another uncle sang Drake's drum. It was very warm in the little house. Auntie Hannah, who had got up to the parsnip wine, sang a song about bleeding hearts and death, and then another in which she said her heart was like a bird's nest. And then everybody laughed again, and then I went to bed. Looking through my bedroom window, out into the moonlight and the unending smoke-colored snow, I could see the lights in the windows of all the other houses on our hill and hear the music rising from them up the long, steadily falling night. I turned the gas down, I got into bed. I said some words to close and holy darkness, and then I slept. And that is the conclusion of Dylan Thomas's A Child's Christmas in Wales. Please do forgive a couple of the reading errors on this part. This is a one-shot dial on this, and actually, quite frankly, each of my podcasts, this is how I do it. I figure I'd rather just say it as it is. If it's rough, it's rough. Like I said, this is not to make any money, and this is an opportunity for me to share things that are important to me as a reader, as a writer, and obviously with the essays and the critical essays that are going to be coming in the coming year. If you have a chance, please go to YouTube and dial up Dylan Thomas and listen to him read it. Obviously, this is his book, his story, and to hear it in his voice and the way he regales it is absolutely wonderful. It's a favorite of mine. I just want to wish you all a very Merry Christmas wherever you are. Be safe, and let's pray for a good 2021 as we reach the end of a very long, dark, and troubling year. I wish you all well, and until next time in 2021, look forward to the next essay that it will offer in this podcast, These Small Hours. This is Russell Cordell Staker signing off from Park City, Utah.